I like to keep my shop clean and well organized, but my welding rod storage has gotten out of control. Over the years, I've added more alloys and diameters, and it's really gotten to be a mess. So my plan for today is to make a nice, organized system to hold all of my welding rod. The design is based on inexpensive ABS pipe. You can get this in any building supply store, and I chose 1.5-inch pipe, which seems ideal. So the plan is to put 2 pieces of pipe in a simple sheet metal holder, and each level will have 2 of these trays. So the lower level will have 4 tubes, and I'll build the system up for 5 levels, so I'll have storage for 20 different types of welding rod. And you can make this larger if you wanted. So the first step is I'll show you how to lay out the trays and bend them. I like to use a marker to put a stripe of ink on the metal so my layout lines show clearly. I'm using a dial caliper to mark the metal, but you could do this with a scale and a scriber. The marks only need to be on the edges of the metal, since I line the edges up on the brake and the shear. I'm visually aligning the cut lines on the blade of my shear. Now I'm ready to form the trays on the bending brake. The first bend is to 90 degrees, followed by 2 45-degree bends. I'm using a small bevel gauge set to 45 degrees on the lower leaf of my brake. I increase the bend angle until the blade of the gauge is level. Now I can lay out the holes for the screws that will hold the trays in place. I'm using 1032 screws, so I'll punch 3/16 holes. I'm using a Whitney punch to make the holes, which is much faster and cleaner than drilling. It's time to start assembling all the components. I'm using a sheet of aluminum as a backbone that all of the trays will attach to. So I'm using clecos, which are like temporary fasteners, to hold these panels temporarily in place. So I've drilled matching holes in the backbone that match the holes in the trays. So let's start assembling these one layer at a time. So this gives you a pretty good idea of how all the trays fit together. And of course, each tray is set up to take 2 of the plastic tubes that the welding rod fits into. One thing that has occurred to me is that this whole assembly is going to get pretty heavy, and I want to put some lifting handles on this. So certainly I can make openings in here for my fingers to go through, but even better than that, I'd like to put a piece of round stock on the top, perhaps 3/4 of an inch in diameter. And rather than trying to fasten a solid bar to the aluminum sheet, what I think I'll do is I'll bend a piece of aluminum sheet to match this profile. It would be challenging to make the lifting handle in one piece, so I'll form it in 2 pieces and weld them down the center. The first step is starting the tight curl that's needed at the top of the part. I'm using an 18mm top die, pushing the metal into a urethane lower wheel. I'll use the brake now to put a sharp bend at the base of the round section. Now I can take off the urethane wheel and install the 18mm female die. This die combination will give the finished profile to the pieces. To align the form sections, I placed a steel tube inside the parts, and I'm using a spacer between the flange areas. Now the parts can be held in a vise. I'm using clamps to hold the parts tightly together for tack welding. With the tacks completed, I can remove the tube, and now I can finish weld the joint. When grinding aluminum, I use bar soap to keep the disc from loading up. I'll use a 50 grit sanding disc to cut the weld down flush. It takes a very light touch at this stage, since you can quickly make the metal too thin if you're not extremely careful. The 50 grit scratches are removed with 80 grit paper on an air sander. Now the part is hand sanded. Let's see how the handle fits into place. So I'll slip it over the backbone. I intentionally made this handle 3 inches longer than it needs to be, so I can trim the ends off. The ends often don't form as nicely as everything else. I need to drill 3 holes for screws to hold the handle to the backbone, and the last step will be cutting the oval holes that my fingers fit through. I'm using a hole saw and a milling machine. You could also do this in a drill press or even with a handheld drill. Since the part's already in the mill, it's easy enough to make the straight cuts too. If you don't have a mill, you could do this cutting with a saber saw. I did some careful sanding and filing to clean up the edges of these openings, so the hand grips work great. I buy my aluminum with a PVC coating on one surface to protect the finish. And now that it's time to take the plastic off, I found it helps a lot to heat the metal just a little bit, so I'll use a propane torch for that. Just a little bit of heat really helps this process. And now we're ready to work on the tubes. I've cut each tube to length, and I want to plug one end. I got some 1/4 inch thick ABS sheet, and I'm using a hole saw to cut the plugs. I'll coat the inside of the tube and the edge of the plug with ABS cement. Then I can push them together. And here's the plug cemented into place. I want to label each tube clearly to make it easy to find the welding rod I'm looking for. So here's the plan I came up with. I found some labels for a laser printer that are 1/2 inch by 1 5/8 inches, and my plan is to put one sheet of plastic over the top of this in a laminating press. Then once it's laminated, I can cut the labels out and I'll be able to peel off the paper backing so the adhesive on the label will stick the label onto the tube. After laminating, I used a paper cutter to cut the sheet into strips. Now we'll cut the individual labels from the strip. It helps to use a razor knife to get the paper off the adhesive backing. And now we can position the label and press it down tight. My welding rod holder is finished now, and I'm really pleased with the way it came out. I love having things organized, and now it's easy to find whatever diameter and type of welding rod I'm looking for. I hope this inspires you to organize some of your supplies too.